was truly unique. I don't see anything like it. With all the pen pals we had, and I was writing 50 letters a week at least.
That's amazing.
And people in Poland and Mexico and England and all over the U.S. and Canada, and the music scenes we created. We all, we did everything. We wrote the songs. We, played the songs. We booked the gigs. We fed each other. We wrote about each other in our own magazines. We put out the records. We built that whole fucking scene from scratch, and I don't see many youth cultures doing that. Yeah. And so I feel like that is it's not. I think it's a good way to grow up, and as long as you can avoid the drugs too much, I think it's a really fucking good way to grow up. And so I think it affects my life, and I have a nice, occasionally snotty attitude that I proudly my old punk past, and I hope my kids learn how to live the way to live with that kind of spirit of independence that the best aspects of punk rock have.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I'm just looking back over my questions because you just touched on a few different things, and I think sorry, I'm going to be jumping a little bit here because I just realized I missed one. No, and I really, it is nice to hear you say that, because I mean, it's one of those things where even just being in grad school, being in a new city, like in Pittsburgh, I booked shows, I was much more active in the scene, and here it's, A, I don't have the time, like deadlines and papers, and B, it's just it's a totally different feeling than Pittsburgh here, but it's still just such an active part of how I approach discussions in class, how like my base level for understanding some of the things that we're reading, like getting in touch with like looking at documents on neoliberalism and just being like, this is the stuff I've been thinking about since I was 15 without even knowing it, And that's what I always find so interesting about the punk scene and getting into getting into this sort of more academic ways of thought. But one of the questions, or were you going to say something?
Oh, no, I was the same way in grad school. In grad school, I became more aesthetically interested in being punk, too. I cut off all my long hair, dyed it hot pink, wore the leather and the studs and everything. And being a punk rocker was very important to me in that setting. And also, I felt like in grad school was interesting that I was able to, and I was doing tons of political activism, too, then probably more political activism than punk rock stuff, although I was still doing that. You ever heard of a zine called Profane Existence?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, I used to work on Profane Existence after Hippie Corps.
Okay.
And so I was doing profane stuff, and I was doing various anarchist organizations, and I was doing grad school. And everything I was reading and learning in grad school, I was able to apply to the streets and to the scene. And then everything I was learning there, I was able to use my grad school to provide a theoretical framework for. I was really able to do that, and I really enjoyed that. And I felt sorry for the rest of my fellow grad school students, because I felt they lived pretty sheltered lives, that they just hung out with each other and didn't really know they talked about, I was political science, and so they talked about politics, but I didn't have any fucking experience in politics, whereas I felt I had a lot of experience, at least with one aspect of engaging in politics, and my punk identity and my experiences with punk were central to that.
Yeah, I absolutely. One of my other questions, and especially since you're pretty well traveled, you've been in, and then also traveled in bands and things, do you feel that food practices and ideologies about food play much of a role in the punk scene?
Yeah, I think they play much of a role, if anything. I think that cooking and being vegetarian and vegan are great, but I think they become identities for people. I think that becomes an excuse, or that becomes it becomes a form of identity politics rather than a form of activist or movement politics. And I will never talk shit about punk, because I hate people who were in the punk scene for 3 years and then leave and then say they grew up or whatever and they're too mature for it. But my critique of punk and what kind of led me out of it was, I think that there's so many are so interested in punk rock as a lifestyle, and then veganism as a lifestyle or vegetarianism lifestyle, and that becomes for them a form of politics, and it's not. It's an alternative, and that's cool. But tell me, for me, politics is about recognizing that we live in a fundamentally unjust immoral capitalist system, and that has to be organized against and overthrown, and that requires organization and politics. It's simply eating right or eating the correct foods or doing things that, change my lifestyle so I consume less or something. That's all great on the individual level. That has nothing to do with political change. And I think too much of punk, and certainly too much of the whole animal rights movement is all individualist, is way too individualist. So I think that, I don't know if this is contradictory for a book.
You're starting to break up real bad.
What'd you say?
The connection just got kind of crummy.
I just said that I think that too much focus on food, politics, and the alternative music scenes, because I think it's essentially a form of identity politics.
Okay.
And too many people go around thinking, as I used to think, I'm fully guilty, but thinking being a vegan or consuming less resources is changing the world, and it's not. It's great if you like to do it. If it's your preferred way of living, cool. But recognize it is a lifestyle. It is an alternative lifestyle, but it is not a lifestyle that challenges the unjust structures of capitalism. And I believe that if you want freedom, then you need to build freedom movements to fight against capitalism. And I think too much of the focus on food and animal rights doesn't lead to movements and struggle, but it leads to kind of moralism and identity politics. So I think there's too much, frankly.
So you think there's too much in punk? And do you think it's gotten more with... I
think there's too much identity. I think there's too much on animal rights in punk, and there's too much focus on individual behaviors in punk,
Yeah. And do you think has that changed over time? Like, do you think?
Well, I left the punk scene in Minneapolis in the mid-'90s over these issues, which came to a head at an anarchist center, where the anarchists were between anarchists who wanted to do politics and punk rockers who wanted to be punk rockers, and it was their identity that mattered more than anything. So I kind of was out by the mid-'90s, and I've only seen the punk scene from a distance, sometimes a close distance, but a distance, when I moved back to Phoenix, and I've really been pretty far out of it for the last 7-8 years. So I don't know, but the punk scene seemed very similar to me. People use Facebook and all kinds of electronic tools and shit, but other than that, the scene seems pretty similar, both its strengths, its wonderful aspects, and its weaknesses.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, you touched on it. I'm trying to think. And you've kind of touched a little bit throughout, looking at, what's interesting to me is I feel like the punk scene, has had this long history of having a focus on food issues. And what do you think about the fact that kind of is now the mainstream sort of thing, like having this like huge concern about the food system?
Well, I think what it says is that punk rockers are on the cutting edge of stuff in the 80s and 90s, and that the punk scene, if you think about it, of Generation X has been kind of on the wave of a variety of trends and fashions, whether for good or bad, I don't know. But like the grunge stuff musically, I think the whole gentrification of the inner city. Why did the cities? What's the first sign of the neighborhoods turned? Is that you can see punk rockers living there. Because once the punks come, then the artists come, then the uppies come. So I think that punk has been at the edge of Generation X, especially. That punk has been at the edge of a lot of these contemporary trends. And now that the punks from that generation are adult, their ideas are increasingly influential in the public sphere. And so I think we were just I think one reason why it's so popular and trendy now is in part because of the alternative scene made those issues, and people have carried through with them and expanded them. And now when you got more capital, and you can turn that into magazines and TV stations and shows and things like that. But I think we're at the cutting edge. That has to do as much as where we're at in terms of our generation, and where our generation is now, as it did the music scene, the scene itself. But I think the scene should take some credit for that.
Yeah. Well, that I think is the bulk of really my main questions.